This video is for new chess players or people who have played a little bit of chess but don't know anything about opening moves. So in this video I'm going to show you what you can play for black to start the game off, to get off to a good start against the two most common moves that white will make at the start of the game. So the first move we're going to look at is e4, and I recommend you play e5 to control this d4 square. Now if white decides to play d4 anyway, you can simply capture it. And if they recapture with the queen, now you can gain a tempo by moving your knight to c6, attacking their queen. Tempo just means it's like an extra move, like you get a free move almost, because you're developing your knight, and at the same time you're attacking their queen. So obviously they have to save their queen. If they move, let's say, back here, now you can develop another piece. And if you'll notice, you have two knights already developed, and white still has all their pieces on the back rank. So this is a great start to a game if you're black. And that's why white normally will not play pawn to d4 on the second move. So we saw that d4 was not a great move for white. So we'll back that up. The most common move that white plays is knight to f3. So they're attacking your e5 pawn. And what you can do is just simply play knight to c6 to defend it. And now there are two lines that we're going to look at. White can play bishop to c4, or white can play bishop to b5. So we'll start with this bishop to b5 line. The idea is that they're putting pressure on your knight so that they can recapture your e5 pawn once the knight is gone. However, there's a little trick that you can play, and so I actually recommend that you play this a6 move. And when they capture your knight, you can recapture with this pawn, and at first glance it looks like you're giving away this pawn for free. But if they capture it, you now have this little move queen to d4, getting a fork on their knight and their pawn. So a logical move for white would be to retreat the knight to save it, and then you can capture their e4 pawn with check. Since they can't castle when they're in check, really the only move that makes sense is to block with the queen, and then you can trade. And black is actually in a great spot right here. So you can play something like bishop f5 attacking this pawn, and they'll have to play most likely d3 to block it. And then you can castle queenside. And black is in a great position. So the reason is because you're going to simply develop your pieces. Your knight's coming out, your bishop's coming somewhere, probably here or here, and then this rook's coming over to put some pressure on the king. You have two open files for your rooks. All your pieces are going to be developed to great squares, and it's just a really solid position for black. So this is a great way to start your game against e4 and the bishop b5 line that we just looked at. So going back to this position, previously we looked at this bishop to b5 line. The other common move is bishop to c4, and they're putting some pressure on your f7 pawn. What I recommend that you do is play bishop to c5, and you're putting pressure on their f2 pawn as well. Most commonly they will either castle or play d3. Sometimes these moves will transpose, so it doesn't really matter. So let's just look at d3. And then you can play knight f6, just developing your knight. And if they castle, you can simply play d6. And a lot of players will play bishop g5 to put a pin on your knight. But there's nothing to worry about there. You can simply play bishop to e6, threatening their bishop. So if they don't do anything, you can trade it off. But if they take you can recapture. And you do have doubled pawns, which is something that sometimes can be a bad thing. But in this case, it's pretty good, because this pawn actually controls some very important central squares. And next move you can castle, and your rook is going to end up on a nice open, half open file. So this is a great way to start the game. You have good control of the center, your pieces are developed to good squares, and it's very, very simple. Like I said, you castle, you bring your queen up, your rooks are connected, and again, it's a great start to the game for black. The third and final example we're going to look at is instead of e4, if white plays d4. So what I recommend you do is play d5, to prevent them from playing both pawns in the center. If they do now, you can just capture it. And the most common reply for white is c4. This is called the Queen's Gambit. And it's a gambit because if you notice, this c4 pawn is not being defended. So you can simply capture it and get a free pawn. However, it's not actually a free pawn, and very tricky for black. You have to be careful and know what you're doing if you're going to accept it. So I believe it's just easier for newer players to not accept the gambit and play e6. If they capture you, you can recapture with your pawn. Now most of the time white will play knight to c3, putting pressure on this pawn, and you can defend it with knight to f6. And then a lot of beginner players will play bishop to g5, pinning your knight. And now you can set a little trap for them. So if you move this knight here, knight b to d7, it looks like white can capture on d5 and win a pawn because of this pin. And so it basically goes like this. They capture your pawn, you capture it back, and they take with their knight because they're thinking, okay, if you capture my knight, you're going to lose your queen. Well, actually, that's the best move for black. You do capture the knight, and you do lose your queen. And the reason being, now you can follow up with bishop to b4 check. And white has no other options except to play queen to d2 to block the check, and you can take the queen. And so after they capture you back, when you recapture, after all the dust settles, white has 2 pieces left, and you have 3 pieces left. So essentially you won a piece from all of that. This is a very good line for black. It's a blunder if white actually accepts it. And if we go back to this position right here, so after you recapture, they're better off to just play something like e3, and then you can play c6 to defend your pawn. And this is still an okay opening for you. You can follow up with bishop e7 to break the pin, castle, and you're off to a decent start. So that's the third and final opening. I hope you learned something. I hope that helps you kind of have an idea of what you can play for black if you're just starting out. Let me know if you learned something. Give it a thumbs up and subscribe if you want more videos like this. Thanks a lot.